Classic mistake. Classic rookie mistake.
Well, maybe you head down to Lake County for your snack.
Me as well.
Nice explanation. That's nice.
We are ready to go.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Committee of the Whole work session where we're supporting community through quality public service. It's 10:30, and to begin, we have our agenda, and you can see that we have minutes from our last Committee of the Whole meeting from May 17th. And then we have a really special presentation to start us off this morning, a presentation on TIF, Tax Increment Financing, that's being provided by Jason Hale, our new director for our HRA. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you, Commissioner Sullivan. Thank you very much for having me. I know that TIF is a four-letter word in a lot of people's minds, and so I'm hoping to bring it back to a three-letter acronym that makes sense for folks. And you folks had the slides ahead of time, so I'm going to try to go through them expediently, but there's a lot to unpack, and I want to make sure that if you have any questions at the end, we have time for that. So with that, I had the clicker. I was going to ask her to change it. Perfect. You probably saw this, but these are some of the TIF districts that I worked on for the City of Duluth and the HRA and the EDA. It might be surprising given these. I do not believe that TIF is a good tool for everyone or for every project. I think it depends, like any other resource the government has at its disposal. I think you need to carefully vet it. And in fact, statute requires that we do so. That needs to pass a couple of tests, and I'll get into that in a minute. But these were all projects that passed those tests, and because of them, housing and other things were built. And without them, or but for the assistance, it would not have happened. So that's one of the key indicators of whether or not it's for the public good, and passing a test is without it, would it happen? If the answer is no, then it's qualified to accept TIF in some amount. Well, what is it? I like the graph at the right just because it, visuals help me anyway. So if you look at the purple line, the base AV, and typically in Minnesota counties, EMV, estimated market value, is what the assessor calls it. And this is just base assessed value. When you establish a TIF district, it freezes the value and the proportionate property tax in time. So an easy example is if a property is contributing $5,000, a commercial property, to the tax rolls, and let's say the TIF district is 20 years long, for that 20 years it will continue to provide the $5,000 in property taxes. So it doesn't go down at all, and it stays the same until the district is fulfilled or expires or is terminated. At that point, of course, then the entire amount of the available increment goes back to the tax roll. So the increment, it's called tax increment because the increment is the difference between that original value, the base AV, and then what it appreciates over time. It would, in theory, the assumption is every time you do a district, the value that was there before is going to be less than the value of the project when it's completed. It has to be, otherwise there is no increment. So if the property is already producing a significant tax base, it doesn't make much sense to use TIF because it will just, sometimes it could go down if you demolish a commercial use and put a house there, for example. That doesn't make any sense. There are also thresholds of project size that make sense. For example, I used to have a lot of folks ask, well, hey, can we do a TIF district for this, twin home project? We want to do something. No. The size, the administrative burden, it doesn't make any sense. In fact, a TIF plan, which I'll get to in a minute, that we pass the cost on to the developer, whoever the builder is, but that's still $15,000. So for build, it just doesn't. The numbers don't make sense. There's a point at which, and it's somewhere between $500,000 to $1 million, is kind of depending, is the threshold where TIF actually makes sense to use. Otherwise, it's just too administrative and burdensome. What can it do? It can do all of these things according to statute. So Chapter 469 in statute covers HRAs, EDAs, the authority's abilities, and there are specific statutes about tax increment financing, who can use it. HRAs can use it, EDAs, like I said, can use it, counties can use it, and cities can use TIF. So of course, I have a particular agenda, that's housing. But removal, it can do several things at once, and actually a number of the projects that I was able to work on in the past checked several boxes, which is why it was a home run. We removed blight. Several of them were old buildings that had been vandalized, had multiple fires in them, had people squatting in them, dangerous situation, drug use, that sort of thing. Removing that and then constructing something entirely new that provided housing, and some of them were mixed use. So For a variety of reasons, you can see, well, we're going from maybe a derelict structure or a vacant property, we're putting something new on there that's providing a public good, and it will increase the tax base. It's just a patience game. And the last thing I think actually is particularly important in Cook County, public infrastructure. TIF can be used to help finance that, and we know that that's difficult, especially when Grand Marais is the only place where public utilities are really available. The biggest change, I'd say, from the South Shore to here is the availability of public utilities or the lack thereof. And so developers have to try to get their head around what are the costs associated with a well for 40 units of housing or something. You know, it's just a different sort of calculus. TIF versus TAF. So this is something that a lot of people get a little confused about. You already had, I think, Bruce from Ellers come up and talk to you. Very knowledgeable guy, of course, you know. And he explained abatement, I think, is what okay. These are the key differences. Really, it's the second bullet. It's the term. So the reason that people prefer to go to TIF, there's really two reasons. One is the term of tax abatement is limited statutorily, and the county can only do a certain amount or percent of its property tax base is abatement. So there's actually when you hit, I think it's 2%, I'd have to double check, but there's the figure in statute. If you hit above that in property tax base, you're cut off from abatement. State won't let you do anymore. There's no such thing for TIF. So that's part of the reason. Another big reason is because finance agencies and banks are comfortable leveraging TIF up front. So I believe it's in here, a very common tool, I'd say probably 90% of the projects that I've worked on, the developer will get what's called a TIF note from the city or the EDA or whatever, and leverage that at their bank. So, you're buying a house, for example, it's pretty analogous to a mortgage. You're buying a house, the bank will give you, let's say 80% of the loan to value. You still have that 20% to make up. Let's say the developer brings in 15%, but the math is so bad, because it is, as we were talking about earlier, it's just a huge math problem, especially here. There's a 5% gap. I'm making this situation up. So you've got 80% from the lender, 15% from the equity partners, and there's 5% that there's nowhere to fill. That's where TIF could be used to fill that gap. And the developer can take the promise from the city or county or EDA or what have you, HRA in this case, and say to the bank, here's a promise from the local government that they'll pay this note. So in other words, all the tax increment or whatever we agree upon gets paid back to pay it off. And the bank will then leverage that. So they'll say, instead of waiting for 20 years or however long the district is, the bank will give them a mortgage on it up front. So they will lend more money, because almost always when projects can't get built, it's because there's a cost delta at the beginning. There's just a construction cost problem. So the TIF can be leveraged up front to bring more money up front to build it. And historically speaking, property tax payments are pretty stable. And a tool that I've used in concert with St. Louis County is called a minimum assessment agreement, and it protects the county. And what it says is we're agreeing, developer and county, that it's going to be valued at least this much for the duration of your district. Because the question is, well, what if it goes down, and how does that affect? And I'll get into that in a minute. All that's to say, I'm getting in the weeds, I know, but all of TIF is the weeds. All of that's to say, there's a gap. TIF can be used to fill it when it's appropriate. And the big difference between abatement is that you can leverage a TIF note through a bank, and usually they roll it in the mortgage. So you think about, you're buying a house, you have a first and second mortgage, they just the one bank packages it together and gives all of the money to fill the gap. Okay.
So,
yeah, go ahead.
on that note, the projects that we approve for abatements are having challenges with financing because of inflation and everything, because of the everything. Could TIF in one case give more options for leveraging?
Possibly. Yeah, I'd have to look at the particular project pro forma, but I think so. And it would depend on their bank. But again, property taxes are, what is that saying? Death and taxes are the two things you can't escape. So usually banks aren't afraid that, the only way in which it doesn't happen is if the developer doesn't pay their taxes. And that's the beautiful thing about TIF or abatement. If you don't pay it, they don't get it. So I'll get into that in a minute. Great question. Okay, kind of covered this already. These are the folks and the entities that can use TIF. And there are I think it's now 90% of districts in Minnesota are redevelopment districts. The reason is because they can go up to 25 years and because you can use them for a variety of types of projects. So it's got a little more stringent requirement to qualify. There's a whole bunch of rules around lot coverage being improvements and how much of that has to be blighted, 50%. So it's really fun reading if you're interested. Statute lays it out nicely. But the gist of it is, for housing development, really there are two. There's a housing TIF district, kind of makes sense. The big difference between these two is the housing requires a certain level of affordability. So whereas the redevelopment district could be used for a commercial project, could be used for anything as long as it qualifies as blighted property, the housing district says 20% of the houses or units have to be available at 50% AMI or 40 at 60. Again, I'm not going to go deep in the weeds. That's the big distinction there. Here's an argument against TIF. So when you hear, I'm assuming this is the case in Cook County. Somebody used TIF, let's say in the 80s or 90s, and maybe there were some shenanigans involved, and it didn't go as well as it should have, and now there's kind of a generally bad taste in the community's mouth about it. That's my assumption. Every community I've talked to has had that happen. So you are special, but you're not that special. What has changed since is statute around TIF, how it can be used, guardrails and administrative requirements around it. So it would be very difficult in my mind for someone to be able to abuse tax increment the way that it's structured today. I mean, where there's a will, there's a way. Somebody's going to fight. But that's why we have people vet it and we have third parties help us and that sort of thing. But the argument against it is, this is the most common one I have heard. Well, what if, so let's say there's lot A, pick one in town that you know of. The city's municipal lot, there we go. They own one on 61, right? Right by their warehouse, okay. We all know where that is. They say, let's say we did a TIF project there for housing or something. And over time, that of course appreciates in value. And then when the TIF district's done, the whole thing is back in the tax rules. The argument against that is, well, what if something was built there that didn't use TIF and we could have captured that entire improvement right over the 20, 25 years? It's a legitimate argument. The devil's in the details. Well, what project is happening there? Like, how is it compared to the proposed project? So if you're putting up a pole barn or you're putting up a 40-unit apartment building, those are very different things. And it will not take long for the apartment building to surpass the taxing, and there's an example I have later in the presentation that points to this. So it is not illegitimate, I'm not saying that, but the question's, of course, that pole barn in this example, would it have been built only there, or is there another lot they would have found to build it? Because then it's a moot argument. If they could have found another place that's appropriate, it would have happened anyway. So there is merit to this, but it's a little bit of a red herring in some sense. It's like, if that was the only place available and it was an equal value, production or development, of course, that doesn't make any sense. We shouldn't use TIF.
And you can't, right? Because
If they didn't need it.
if the but not for.
Yep, but for test wasn't passed, exactly. Then it wouldn't have, so the project didn't need it. But it would have, according to, to the argument, which is true, it would have, the property tax jurisdictions would have collected that over however long the district would be, 20 or 25, whatever it is. But again, it's, okay, so if we're patient for 20 years or 25 years or whatever the district is, what happens at the end of that? How much more quickly are we going to make up for that? And is the project that's being built a public good or serving some need? Because that's the question, is a pole barn, serving the need, or is 40 units of housing serving the need, right? It comes down to the kind of political calculus and the community's desire. This is fun. If you didn't know, we're in a high-tech state. Again, we're special in Minnesota, and we're Cook County's even more special. So we see, and I just like to show this to help people understand, why is TIF even needed? It's a big question. What's the deal? Well, in the last couple of years, I think it's become pretty evident how challenging things are with logistics and costs and everything. That's a lot. When I first started the TIF circus, it wasn't quite the same. It was still complicated, and it's even more so. And you all know that. But one of the reasons in Minnesota that it's such a useful tool is because we are a high-tax state, generally. You can see we score pretty high in, I don't know if that's the right way of phrasing that, in several categories, and we're in the middle of the range in other categories. Property tax, if you talk to any developer, as a proportion of, or as when you look at the other tools that are available, it's like the single greatest local tool that we have. And again, I'm not for handing out property tax cash or writing big checks to developers. That's a big kind of misconception. People think we're just writing a blank check. That's not how it works. And I don't support that. I support finding the line between what they need to get it done and what the public needs. We find that balance, and if it makes sense, we do it. If it doesn't, we don't. But the two tests, and we already talked about this, Commissioner Mills, the but for, like you mentioned, but for it, would it happen? If the answer is yes, it would still happen, then it shouldn't get TIF. If it's no, then we should consider it. Also, are there other tools? So TIF isn't the first resource we go to, but by way of example, the Sawmill Village project that we all know about, and then the Bluefin Bay one, they applied at the same time for Minnesota housing funding. Sawmill got awarded. Because our legislature did not pass a bonding bill or bill this year, there is no Minnesota housing funding for the workforce housing program. So we can't apply for it. So there's one less tool in our toolbox over the next year. And with rates going up, and I'm sure you've heard all about this, there is going to be a more complicated environment to work in. So we just have to look through the things that are available. And if there's seemingly fewer and fewer of those, depending on the year, so it's worth consideration. If we can't find anything else that checks the boxes, we should look at it. That's my position or recommendation. How's it leveraged? Like I said, there's two ways. One way that used to happen a lot more is the county or city or whomever would bond for it, like a revenue bond, and then the property taxes would pay back the bond. So basically the county or municipality was acting as the bank. I don't like that. It puts the county, city, whatever at more risk. Doesn't need to happen. Instead, you do the pay-as-you-go note, which is what I was talking about earlier, which effectively means the county, or in this case the county, the HRA says, tell you what, we promise that if you pay your taxes, you will get 90% of those back to pay your TIF note. If you don't, you don't. So if they stop paying taxes, the biggest risk time for any project is during construction. If it doesn't get built, then there's a whole mess. If it's halfway cooked, the bank's like, nah, do we have to finish it, or who's going to finish it? Do we suing people? When something's built, you have an asset to work with. So once it's built, they just have to pay property taxes, and then they get some of that back to pay the bank back the cash that they fronted them, right? If they don't make that payment, the bank doesn't get their money, and that's between the bank and the developer. We are not obligated to pay the bank. We're only obligated to pay them back what they pay us. It's funny because it comes to the county, and the county sends it back. It's just like anyway.
Well, what's the disadvantage to the pay-as-you-go?
Probably just that we have to draft a note. I mean, it's just it's a couple more documents. But as compared to the bonding, it's the lowest risk option for any municipality. There are more risky options. I wasn't even going to mention those.
Thank you.
Yeah, right, yeah. This is the least risky one, and it's the one that most developers are presuming to use. I've had, I think once, somebody asked me if they could bond, and I said no. And then we did this instead. Most people understand, yeah, we're going to take the risk. So, you saw the slide, so I'm not going to go through each of these. But I just want to point out there are costs to it. I'm not trying to be naive about it or put on rose-colored glasses. But the costs, I think, are mitigated pretty strongly by the potential benefits. So number 3 on their staff time. There are 2 ways of handling that. One, if we need any legal services or we need a financial consultant like Ehlers, who I'm a big fan of, I've worked with them for years, we have the developer pay for their time. That's the easiest way to do it. So the cost is really so for example, and I'll go through this in a little bit, when we look at a TIF project, a potential one, I look through their pro forma. I ask them any questions I would have. If there's any glaring obvious things, like if they're assuming a 10% vacancy rate, that's crazy. They shouldn't do that. So I look for those kind of things. And then if I give them a ballpark amount, like it's probably going to produce, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm going to finish this and we'll get to that in a minute. Just so excited about TIF. The benefits, of course, are the community goals being met. And one of the things I've found is when people understand, yes, we want housing in this case, right? We all know that we need it. We want to show up to do it. When they realize that we're not writing anybody a blank check and that we're doing some thorough analysis of, like, they have to pass these tests to get it. And also at the end of the day, what are we getting out of it? Well, we're getting 30, whatever the number is, 20 units of housing. We're getting a property tax increase, probably pretty substantial. And that's forever until that property needs to get rehabbed or, let's say 50 years or something like that usually. It's harder to argue against it. when it doesn't cost the county or municipality anything, except for some of my time, which is why I'm here, right? The last thing is that, and that's number 3 and number 4, in a TIF district, statute allows the administrative body to collect 10% of the district amount. You don't have to, but usually municipalities do that. So 100% of the tax bill gets paid. The county gets to keep 10% for admin costs, and you just have to document the costs to manage the TIF district. And then the 90% goes back to the developer. So it also makes the county whole more often than not. Usually it's more than it needs to be. These are fun. If you have questions about these, let me know. But they're in the weeds. Here's the example scenario that I want to go through quick. This is, I think, probably pretty appropriate. You could probably imagine something like this in town or just outside of it. Got a couple acre parcel, has a warehouse or kind of an old building on it. It's contributing $5,000 in taxes today. Somebody wants to build housing on it, and it would be an estimated $5 million according to the county assessor. This is all based on an example I looked at for Hermantown, and generating $62,000 in taxes. So obviously that's a $57,000, $500 increase. So when you go through the math, we'll skip to number 4 quickly. Again, I just want to remind you, the $5,000 originally continues. They still get that, so nobody's losing anything. At number 4, at the end of the district, that higher amount, the increase of $57,500 now goes out to back on the tax rolls and goes to everyone. And this whole thing is assuming there's no inflation or no property increase. You know, I'm being very conservative. If you mathed it out, it's more like $90-something thousand over 26 years. The point is, it takes less than a year to make up what that blighted property would have earned in 25 years. So that's an example, and this is, obviously it's leaning one way to try to show you what it can really do. If the property was worth more than $250,000 originally, well then it's gonna, the gap's gonna be smaller. But again, after it's done, boom, we've already recouped everything we would have collected. You would have removed blight from the neighborhood and also had, for 24 years with construction, you would have had housing. That's the point. Okay. This, I think, is interesting. I've heard a lot of folks say, and I get it, it's the same thing in Duluth. Why do we need to help? Why can't people just buy their own housing? When I grew up, we didn't have any help. I hear you. Neither did I. But some people do, and a lot of people do increasingly, and this is why. Housing versus income. It's an incredible difference. And it's the single biggest purchase that almost everyone will make. And everybody needs it. So there's no saying, well, I don't need to buy that or I don't need to rent. Well, yeah, you do. Most people want to. So I just like to show some context as to why it's a lot harder. Housing is in relative terms, way more expensive than it used to be. Okay, I already went through some of this and I'm going to cruise through it. You already have the sheets, so if you have any questions, please, you can go through this. This is my process that I've shared with other communities too about going through TIF. This is where I work with folks like the county or the city of Grand Marais. We do the entitlement stuff. We vet the project. We figure out if it's good, if the community wants it. Is there a but-for test to pass? Is the gap legitimate? Oh, one other thing that I like to tell folks is, and I kind of poke fun at developers, never tell them how much is available. Because then they'll say like, well, yeah, that's how much we need. Yeah, well, that's magic. Performance can be, creative accounting is a thing. So I always ask them what they think they need. And then I do the calculation and say, you're either close or you're not close. Or you need to change the project or we need to look at some assumptions. If we can reach an agreement, like this makes sense, and yes, your pro forma looks legitimate and there's a big gap because the world, then let's talk. Yeah, so this is just what I do calculations. And I used to have actually the calculation. I took it out because I don't think you want to. I mean, it's fun if you want to calculate TIF. I think it's fun. The county, right. So in this case, the county is going to review the projects and figure out what the county assessor, what actually, like, so Bob would say, when it's done, it's probably going to be worth X. That's his job, is to determine value. And he's going to, of course, probably put, this is not a guarantee of value, this is based on a, he has to. But it gives us something to say, okay, this is a realistic estimate when it's done, and we can show the community this isn't out of thin air, this is based on data that the county has. And this is what it's going to contribute to the tax roll, and this is what's available for the development. Okay, who cares? I care. It's an application. The key here is they need to submit data, they need to make it convincing, they need to show their case, and we need to make them pay for it. That's the short version. Engaged consultants. I've used LHB and I've used Ehlers and others, but those are the two that I've used the most with TIF districts. In fact, the guy that I've used for LHB, Mike Fisher's his name, he actually owns some property just up the way. He called me when he found out I was coming up here, and he wants to take me on tours. But my point is, there are people who love being up here, and there are people who know the area and love working here. And you do the TIF plan. So I just want to take a second to explain something. There's a TIF district is established by statute by a TIF plan. It sounds really fancy. It used to be like 40 pages, and now it's much better. It's like 15. What the TIF plan does is say, these are the parcels we're committing to this district. A TIF, when you establish TIF, you say, yep, we're going to do it. We want that project. It's called a TIF district, and you establish the district, and it includes whatever parcels you want to put in there. When you do that, the TIF plan is the thing that goes before the commission or the council or whomever the body is and says, here are the parcels, here's the proposed, at least here's the first proposed project. You could do a larger district expecting something over time. But here's what we're proposing now. Here are the caps. Here's as much as can be produced in this district or as much as we're going to allow in tax increment. And here's the statute, all the things. It lays out the district for the municipality. Something that is a nuance, but I end up getting a lot of questions about it. Housing TIF districts that require that affordability piece, they're more flexible for usage than other districts. And what I mean by that is, if you did a housing project and let's say it went gangbusters and it appreciated in value over time, and there's extra TIF, let's say you did it for 25 years. That's the other thing about TIF. If it actually appreciates more than you would think in value, it'll pay off sooner. So we agree with the developer, you're going to get $2 million or 25 years, whatever happens first, and then it's done. Let's say it takes 18 years because property values increase. Then it's done. Then they're back on the tax rolls. So it ends early. The county can, in this TIF plan, say, we said $2 million, we're going to allow up to $3 million. If there's extra, you can then collect that and use it for another housing project. So that's not common with other TIF districts because it has to be an affordable housing project, it has to be for affordability. But you can pool extra TIF to be used for another project. It's just a nice trick. If you don't use it in a certain time frame, you give it back to the taxing jurisdictions. Okay. Yep. Project commences. Great. Last slide here. This is just an overview of what I was able to use TIF for. And again, it wasn't just TIF. There were historic grants, there were tax credits, there were deed grants, there were Minnesota housing grants. So there were all of the things. It was a patchwork quilt, a lot of these projects. But TIF was a critical component to 940 units of housing. I mean, those all passed the but-for test. And when you, see, even the computer got bored. I get it. Well, I think you have this. Some of you might have this sheet in front of you, but I just want to capture. That was in 6.5, probably about 6 years by the time I got my legs under me, where I started getting really involved with TIF, and I didn't like it either, but I started to figure it out. Any questions? Thank you for your patience. That was a lot, but I wanted to kind of break some misconceptions, perhaps.
Thank you so much, Jason.
Yeah.
Question?
I don't have a question, but you kind of touched on this a little bit when it comes to pushback.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't agree with it. I'm trying to see a longer vision, but what I've heard is kind of like what you said. Well, we didn't have to do that back in the day or whatever. And we've kind of run into this with negotiations a little bit too. If an entity or group gets a benefit that others have not,
Yeah, unfair.
that, yeah, even though it has no harm to that,
Right.
non-benefiting group.
It doesn't cost them anything to do
But
it.
because there's not the benefit, they see that as a harm.
Mhm.
It's just a very, it's just an interesting mindset. And I guess it can speak to culture of maybe generations or maybe just different areas or hardships.
Yep.
But it's just something that, I think we should be aware of and be prepared for.
Absolutely.
And in the conversations that I've had, what I've really leaned on is that long-term benefit for the community.
Yep.
And because in the abatements that we approved, that was seen as some people saw that as a handout,
Mhm.
and they didn't get a handout, so then they were harmed by that
Yep.
non-gift. It's just an interesting dynamic there. So
I have heard that argument a few times.
yeah.
Yeah, and I get it.
I do. It's just I don't see other people's. Yeah, I don't see other people's and/or our community's benefit
Mhm.
being just because I didn't get it as a harm. It just doesn't make sense in my mind. So.
Something that maybe this is helpful for you in these conversations is people because they will continue to bring that up. If I
Yeah.
was into
those
gambling, I would
resolve.
gamble
Yeah,
it, right?
Yeah.
I have told folks in talking with them about it, 3 things really. 1, that's great that you didn't need it. Good for you. Like how great that you could do it without help. 2, if it was possible without help, it would have happened a long time ago. And the proof is in the pudding. There's a reason the intern exists because it's not happening, at least not to keep up with demand, right? So the housing need is very apparent in this community in Cook County. And me being here, just my presence, unfortunately, doesn't solve the problem. It's what I can help bring to the table that solves the problem. And one of those tools just is TIF. That's just one of many. So if it didn't need help, why isn't it happening by itself, organically? And then the third thing I like to talk to them about is, do you want your kids or grandkids to be able to move back to Cook County? Because right now they can't. So you may not think you're benefiting from it, but if you want to be able to stay here long-term and housing costs to be affordable, and you want your family to be able to come here and this community to grow, okay, we can help them or we cannot help them. I mean, that's a values question. Do you want to help people to maintain affordable living here and be able to work in Cook County? If the private market could do it alone, it would be happening. There's a reason they're investing in resorts and there's more money in that. And then I've looked at so many pro formas. The numbers are so hard. So I'm not a big fan of, I bootstrapped it, so I get it. I get where that argument's coming from. I get it. It's hard. If you can do it, I'm not mad if someone else needs help. If we can help solve the problem, fantastic.
Right.
The last thing is, we all drive on the streets, and we all like the services, and we all want fire departments. And where does that come from? This is another way of ensuring that we have it 10 years from now. Because they're going to contribute to the tax base. They're going to be buying things down at the shops we all like to go to. So that's not a silver bullet. Those are some of the talking points that I've used. And sometimes people are like, I don't care. Okay. Yeah. And all we can do is try to bring them along. And if they don't like it, I get why, but that's okay. Any other questions? Yeah, I didn't mean to take so much of your time. but I
No,
really
thank you
appreciate it.
so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
It was very, very valuable,
Good.
and I think will be great information for our community. I hope a lot of people watch this.
Yeah, I hope so too, and wherever people are. If you have any questions about TIF, I will bore you. Come on down. I don't know everything. I'm not pretending to be an expert, but you do it long enough and you know enough to be dangerous. So, if there's a good tool for a community that wants something done, let's look at it. Right? Let's look at it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Jason. We
Commissioners.
appreciate
Yeah, my
your
pleasure.
time and your expertise. All right, we have another presentation, and I'd like to welcome Charles Hathaway. He's here today to teach us a little bit about ranked choice voting.
My ears are buzzing.
How so?
I make little pokes with ranked choice voting to the board now.
Oh, good.
Largely to Brady, which I'm sad he can't be here today.
Well, do I need to speak in the microphone?
Please.
You're fine.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me. I really appreciate the chance to talk to you all about ranked choice voting. By way of introduction, I've been in Cook County a couple of years since the start of the pandemic. I came up here after leaving a long career in civil and environmental engineering, water resources primarily. But more to the point, I've been a volunteer for Fair Vote Minnesota, which is the statewide organization that promotes ranked choice voting in Minnesota. Fair Vote Minnesota is a nonprofit. They're nonpartisan. It's not allied with any political party. It's simply an organization that is promoting ranked choice voting as a means of promoting better democracy, better government. And that's what my interest in it is. I just feel like this is an important thing, and we can make things better by a relatively simple change in how we run elections. So, the basic idea here, and we'll talk much more about it, the basic idea as you have here, as you see on the screen, is it's just a different way of running elections. Instead of saying, I want this person, or I want that person, you get to say, well, I would like this person, but if this person can't win, this person would be a good second choice. And if this person, neither of those two could win, I would take that person. So that's the basic idea of how ranked choice voting works. It's really, the concept is quite simple. But you might say, well, why would anything need to change? Why would we want to change what we have going now? And here's the reason, demonstrated by this slide. There really is a problem. One of the things I did, oh, and I forgot, I should pass these around again. This is a prop and a benefit.
Okay. Yeah, I had to stop myself
Please
before.
take as many as you want. But one of the things I did as a volunteer for ranked choice voting, I went around to county fairs in Minnesota. And it was very interesting, primarily southwestern Minnesota, central, southeastern Minnesota, and talked to a lot of people about ranked choice voting, but about government and democracy. And to a one, people said, things are not going well. There is a problem. There's a big problem where government's not getting things done that they need to get done. There is this increasing divisiveness. People to a one say, I hate the negative campaigning. And so people are aware that there really is a problem, and this has to do with the increasing divisiveness means that the system ends up sort of gridlocked. And I should step back for this one. I'm not talking about Cook County here. I'm talking much more about national and statewide politics. But there really is a problem. The partisan primaries are a big part of why this happens, because as it works, who shows up at those primaries are the party zealots. It's a small minority of people really who end up picking, as it's turning out, more and more extreme candidates to run in the general election. Again, Cook County is not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about national and statewide politics. So you end up with candidates who are becoming more and more extreme. There is less and less moderation, fewer and fewer moderates in government than there have been in past years. And I could show you the data on this. It's documented. The number of people involved that is the number of third-party candidates. They are third-party, and new voices are effectively excluded from the system right now. People won't vote for a third-party candidate. They say, no, I'm not going to do that. Either I'm wasting my vote if I do it because I know that person's not going to win, or I may end up inadvertently helping put someone into office that I really don't like. So that's a problem. You under the current system, you are unable to vote for maybe a person you really would prefer, but you won't vote for that person because you're concerned that it will cause a bad effect. So the system right now is keeping these new voices, new opinions, perhaps better ideas out of the public discussion and out of government. And in addition, we have a system where people can get into office in this plurality election system. That's what they call it. You know, basically, you get more votes than the next person, you get to win. In that system, you can get people into office who really do not have majority support. So Jesse Ventura is a fabulous example from Minnesota history, who was elected with 39% of the people voting for him. Well, okay, that's a problem because now roughly 60% of the people didn't vote for Jesse Ventura, probably didn't want him in office. To build a coalition and to get people behind him for policy initiatives becomes very difficult when you are elected by really effectively a minority of the public. So that's a big problem. And the problem is this is baked into the cake, right? This is I heard a person talk about this, and they said, well, you know, actually the system isn't broken. You know, this gridlock is not a effect of the system being broken. In fact, the system is performing exactly as you would expect it to perform, given how it is constructed and managed. So how the cake turns out depends on what you put into it. If you have ingredients that aren't great, you're going to have a result that's not great. So ranked choice voting offers a way to change the mix and produce a better cake.
As long as we can eat it.
So I want to jump right now to show you this how we work things at. So getting back to the candy here, how I work things at the county fairs. So when I would go out to the county fairs, I would have 3 baskets, not all mixed candies like this, but 3 baskets. One with caramels, one with Tootsie Rolls, one with Starburst. And people would come up and I'd say, well, you know, we're here talking about ranked choice voting and democracy. And say, okay, what do I do? I said, well, help yourself to a piece of candy, first of all, but we're going to ask you to vote. So I want you, and we did a little ballots. So what's your first choice of these candies? Second choice, third choice. So just as an example, Commissioner Mills, if you had to vote, what would be your first choice, second?
Caramel.
Caramel would be first choice.
And then Tootsie Roll.
Second choice, Tootsie Roll. Third choice.
Yeah.
Third choice, Starburst. Okay, so we had everybody doing this who came up, and at the end of the day, we'd collected maybe 100, 200 ballots, and the next day we could talk about what happened yesterday. So here's an example. Suppose then, here's how the results turned out. Caramel had 41 first choice votes, Tootsie Roll had 20, Starburst had 39. Now, in a plurality election, Caramel wins right now. So, but again, they don't have majority support really. All you know is that 41% of the people liked Caramel, but you don't know what the other people really cared about. So one thing you can do, and this is what we do in the Cook County primary elections for commissioner, right? We have a primary election, and then we have a runoff election. We narrow it down to 2 candidates. So the beauty of this is you don't need to do that, because you have effectively the results of the runoff election already in your hands. So what we do is we say, look, Tootsie Roll clearly is not going to win, right? But we can cross out Tootsie Roll, and then we say, well, yeah, but who did the Tootsie Roll voters pick as their second choice, right? So this is just like if you had a runoff election. What you do is call everybody back, say, sorry, you Tootsie Roll fans, Tootsie Roll cannot win this election. We're going to have a new election between Starburst and Caramel. Well, but we already know what those Tootsie Roll voters would have done because they told us with their ranked choice ballot. So we look at the second choices of the Tootsie Roll voters and we say, well, 5 of them picked Caramel as their second choice. 15 of them picked Starburst. We simply take those votes, transfer them, the second choice votes to the candidates who were number 1 and number 2. And here's what we find out. Starburst ends up being the winner with 54 votes, and Carmel ends up being second place with 46. Tootsie Roll, of course, was eliminated in the system. No, this is not an endorsement for, as you notice, I brought all 3 kinds here. But that's an excellent question. So, and actually, who tended to win in these mostly was Carmel. Tootsie Roll would almost always turn in last place, but Carmel tended to be the favorite. But anyway, but what you get then is the winner has really support, broad support among the populace. You can say this, even though it's, in a way, it's sort of a close election. But you can say, actually, the Starburst candidate can say, you know, people like me. In general, I'm favored by the voting public. So, well, here's what an actual ballot would look like. Obviously, we're not going to have candy on there. Candidates listed down the side, sample ballots across the top, or the choices are listed across the top, and you fill in the circles, you darken the circles just like you would in a more typical election. This voter said candidate B was his first choice, candidate A was his second, and candidate C was his third choice, right? So, very simple to use. So, what's so great about this? That tends to be the question, right? So, I like this quote. This is, I heard a guy talk about ranked choice voting. He said, you know, ranked choice voting is like the Archimedes lever of political advancement or improving democracy. Archimedes was famously said, give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum and I can move the world. In other words, the guy was saying ranked choice voting is a powerful tool to really move how democracy works. So how is that the case? Well, for a few reasons. One, it allows people to vote for really who they want to vote for. So in that way, it brings new voices into the system. It allows for an expression of support for third-party ideas, third-party candidates, which in the current system is sort of excluded. So it tends to bring in diverse voices. It tends to eliminate negative campaigning, which everybody hates, but everybody does, or the candidates tend to do it. But it eliminates that because, and the candidates who run under a ranked choice voting system will tell you, they say, you know what, from day one, nobody did this, and it's clear why. Like, if I'm running an election against somebody else, Commissioner Mills, for example, I'm not gonna go out and say, yep, I'm great, and that guy's terrible, he's a lawbreaker, he's doesn't go to church on Sundays, and he's, I don't know what else, he's doesn't pay his tax, whatever. So I'm not going to say that because I want the people who might like Commissioner Mills to pick me as their second choice. So I'll say, well, you know, we have our differences, but actually I kind of agree with him at some point. So if you're going to vote for him as your first choice, please think about me as your second choice. So it tends to increase the sort of camaraderie, and in effect, it starts building coalitions even before these. So people start to look for common ground. They look for commonalities rather than in the current system where people say, well, that person's just terrible, so you need to vote for me so we don't let these terrible people get anywhere near the levers of government.
Good and evil.
Yeah, and it's clearly not that. So it helps that I mean, that's another big benefit. It, as I said, produces really people who have majority support, allowing for them to help develop. I mean, one of the big things with government is you develop consensus as you govern around an idea. That is very difficult in our current system. But with ranked choice voting, when you have really people elected with majority support every single time, that effort becomes much simpler, much more natural. It can eliminate the need for primaries. For instance, in Cook County, it could do that. So you could save the candidate's time, save the administration's time. It doesn't always do that, but it has that possibility.
Elections are expensive.
Yeah, they are, and they're a lot of work. And so to have to run 2 elections, to be involved in 2 elections, well, and again, it's going to make people say, wow, okay, this isn't so difficult as I thought. So it's going to allow people to come in. also will allow, as I said before, diverse voices to enter because it sort of reduces the barriers. Currently, they say, well, you know what, in a lot of cases, I'm not getting endorsed by either two political parties. What's the point of running? It's just stupid. You know, it's a waste of my time. So, but under ranked choice voting, people can get on the ballot, and maybe they're only going to get 3 or 4%, but they can still run. They can still show that there is support for that sort of a candidate, that sort of ideas within the community. So, a lot of benefits, I think, and a lot of ways that this a relatively simple change in how we vote can change the outcome and produce a better democracy. Just to let you know, this is not a crazy idea that's only done in a few places. In Minnesota right now, there's 5 different cities doing it: St. Paul, Minneapolis, Bloomington, St. Louis Park, and Minnetonka have adopted it and are using it. And this shows the various states across the United States where it's being used in one form or another. Interestingly, both Maine and Alaska are using it for statewide elections. So for governor of the state, for senators and congressional representatives, they're using it. But it's being used, you know, even, you know, across the southern part of the country in states across the union. And this gets to the point, you know, people say, well, isn't this like a red state thing, or isn't this like a blue state thing? It's like, no, it's not. You look on that map there, these are of all political stripes. Alaska is certainly not a blue state. You know, it's kind of purple, as really as most states in the country actually are. So it's being adopted in many, many places across 50 cities now. More than 50 cities are using it across Minnesota. Fun fact, it's used, ranked choice voting is used by the American Academy of Motion Pictures for picking Best Picture, Best Actor, all the Oscars are voted on using ranked choice voting. It's also used for national elections in Australia, Ireland, Scotland, New Zealand, and been used for decades. So part of the point there is, you know, this is not like something brand new and out of the box and crazy. It's being used many, many places. So just want to mention a few common concerns that people have when thinking about or talking about ranked choice voting, or get brought up from time to time. One is this too complicated? Won't the voters be confused? Well, look, I have people coming up to our booth who are 85 years old and 4 years old, and they have no problem with this concept. They can fill out these ballots. They understand, oh, who's my first favorite, who's my second favorite, who's my third. Not a problem. And again, it's being done already. When you poll people who have participated in ranked choice voting elections for the first time, they tell you by huge margins, 80, 90%, no, this was not difficult to use. In fact, I like it, and I would like to see it used in subsequent elections. So it's not complicated. We know how to do it, and people get it. It's pretty intuitive, actually. Second one is, wouldn't it be difficult or expensive to implement? And the answer is no. We know how to do this. As I say, it's been used in 50 or more cities across the United States. It can be used in local elections. It's being used in primary elections at various places. It's the changes to the voting machines are relatively minor. They can read ballots under a ranked choice voting system. So it doesn't require a huge amount of effort. It's not really typical or tricky or complicated to implement. So it can be done. It's not a big deal. Recently, Minnetonka and Bloomington just got on board, and they revved it up and got it going for the 2022 elections, maybe 2021. Anyway, but they recently adopted it and put it in place, and it requires a little voter education in advance because it's something different, and a little education of the voting, what do you call it? I'm going to be one. Elect the judges at the voting booths. A little education, but not a big deal. Second, isn't this like a trick? Who is it by red state people or blue state people? And it's not. It's again being done across the country. Red states, blue states, red cities, blue states. Utah has 20 or more cities using it. And Utah is, people sometimes say, well, it must be just a blue state thing. Well, it's not, and it's just something that people are seeing as a way to better democracy. And finally, there's this, this is maybe a little too technical, I'll just touch on it briefly. People say, well, isn't really true that you get majority support every single time because there's a matter of so-called exhausted ballots. So going back to the candy example, suppose all those Tootsie Roll voters said, nope, I'm not ranking my votes. It's Tootsie Roll or nobody. Or nothing. So they put, they do something kind of silly. They'll either just fill out first choice Tootsie Roll and then no second or third choice, or they'll put Tootsie Roll first choice, Tootsie Roll second choice, Tootsie Roll third. So that ballot after the first choice becomes invalid, doesn't make any sense. So effectively what those people have done is remove themselves from from their choices and from the runoff election. So after Tootsie Roll is eliminated, as it would be in a runoff election, now their votes, they're not voting essentially in the runoff election, and so whatever happened on the first choice votes with Carmel and Starburst runs. So the point is, if you pull yourself out of the election, we can't count your vote. So that's sort of where this argument goes and what people bring up, but it's specious, I would say. So what could Cook County do? One is, I really appreciate your giving me the time to talk about this today, but part of it is just learning about this and knowing more about it, discussing it with people you come across, constituents, among yourselves, other people within the county. That doesn't show up very well in this. FairVoteMinnesota.org is the organization. You can look at their website. A lot of good information there, videos that explain it, talk about where it's implemented, what it's being used for. And I'll pass this out. Obviously, I don't expect this to be adopted today, but it's a sample resolution of support for the idea and support for what's happening in the Minnesota legislature, which is a so-called local options bill, which all it says is that the local entities, like Cook County, like the city of Grand Marais, city of Lutzen, they could use ranked choice voting in their elections. So that's what the local options bill in the legislature proposes. Because right now, Cook County is prohibited by statute from using ranked choice voting, as are most of the local entities in Minnesota. They don't have the option. So this local options bill says, well, look, you don't have to adopt it, but this gives them the freedom to adopt ranked choice voting for their local elections if they wish. And there's also something in there talking about, there's also a bill supporting the idea of using ranked choice voting for national, for national candidate, or for statewide. So governor, senators, congressional representatives. That's also being proposed and being talked about in the legislature. But the local options bit is really the key thing for Cook County. And then just, be ready to implement it when ranked choice voting passes. And I fully believe it will. I mean, just the momentum is in that direction. I think it's going to happen. It's a matter of time. And I think it's going to happen statewide. I think it's going to happen nationwide eventually. It's just, you can see that things are progressing that way. And it just makes tons of sense. So, again, those didn't show up, unfortunately, sorry. FairVoteMinnesota.org is the website. You can send an email to info@fairvotemn.org, and they'll get back to you if you have questions, or say, what's going on here, I'm concerned about this or that. Or you can email me, and I'm happy to answer questions. So just leave this up here. This is what things look like at the county fairs. It was great, actually. It was a great experience. So,
Commissioner Storley, you have a question.
Well, Cook County is made up of 5 districts.
yes.
And we don't go into a primary unless we get 3 people in one district.
Right.
Which we didn't this year. So we're not having a primary. Okay? Now, I've observed over the years that the number of candidates are getting less and less.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you handle that, just in a normal kind of, this is going to be a district that's open and you get
Right.
Maybe some years you might get 3 or 4, but it's very rare.
Right.
The
Well,
numbers, it's the numbers thing.
yes, and I'll say that ranked choice voting is certainly not needed if you have one candidate and if you only have 2, because then it becomes just like one or the other. That's your choices. And it's not like ranked choice voting solves every problem. For instance, the problem of getting people engaged and getting them to want to run an election. But I will say that, and we've seen this across the state in places where it's being used, it does tend to encourage people to run. They feel like they have much more of a chance under a ranked choice voting system. So it brings in, tends to bring in, well, if they're third-party candidates, but tends to bring in women into the system. It tends to bring in sort of minority or otherwise marginalized people from otherwise marginalized groups into these elections, and it encourages people to run. They feel like they have more of a chance under this system. So is that what
So
sort of
what
thing?
you're depending upon the legislature to pass this overall.
Local
it's-
options, right?
It's an option to do, and then each area decides.
Yeah.
If they want to. But does it like go from year to year? Oh, this year we're gonna do it, but next year we don't.
Well, I would think that once you adopt it, you would keep it. I mean, you would,
Okay.
if you ran it for 10 years and said, no, we don't like this, I guess you could change back. But so like, a sheriff's department could use this. It could be used for auditor elections. It could be used for, any sort of local election. School boards could use this. Again, now it's prohibited. So,
Other questions for Mr. Hathaway?
No, appreciate the information.
Commissioner Hopkins?
So what if, I know we don't have this number this time, but what if you had 10 candidates
Yeah.
for one office?
Yep.
Is it 10 choices on your ballot?
it could be. You can run it that way. What they're doing in some places is actually having sort of a primary and reducing the number down to a more manageable 4 or 5 candidates. Alaska does something like this, as I understand it.
So it's like double ranked choice, or?
Yeah, now let me think. Actually, now I'm thinking about Alaska. No, I was hearing about the Alaska governor's race. Sarah Palin's on the ballot, 2 or 3 other candidates who are fairly well known in Alaska, and then there's a run of, 10 other people on the ballot. And you can rank up to, as many and as many as their candidates. Now, that person way at the end who nobody knows, who runs under the name of Captain Jack Sparrow or something, okay, that person's only going to get 2 points. That person's going to be eliminated, just like Tootsie Rolls, right away, and those votes will transfer up in the system. So this is how, so you can have, it doesn't matter the number of candidates. Now, you might say, well, now, do I have to know everything about all these 20 candidates? And no, the answer is no, you don't. Some people will try to study, and you can rank as many as you want under that system. You could say, Sarah Palin's my first choice, this guy's the first, second, third choice, and Captain Jack Sparrow's my 5th choice. So, you don't have to rank everybody in the ballot. It does put, and I think reasonably so, some obligation on the voters to become informed about who's on the ballot, and I think that's a good thing. But I mean, think of an election you've been involved in. Typically, you know something about more than just one candidate. I mean, probably in a presidential election, for example, you know something about 4 or 5 candidates, and so it wouldn't be that hard for you to rank them, even without completing a master's thesis on So is that kind of what you're getting at, or?
Yeah, somebody who talked to me about this had concerns with how many.
Yeah, I mean, it's easily handled.
Let's see where it could be.
Right.
When do you think I will get to use ranked choice voting for governor in Minnesota?
In the year 2032. It's a way.
There you go.
It's a ways away. It's a ways away. I mean, current governor, you know, somehow his name always pops out of my head. I keep wanting to say Quee. Yeah, sorry. No, I know, I'm way behind. But Tim Walz is a supporter of ranked choice voting, and he would sign the bill if it went through, and it would be adopted for Minnesota statewide. But it has not advanced. Tends to have support in the House, but not so much in the Senate, and so it gets stalled out there. Again,
Because they are trying to protect their position.
well,
They don't, yeah.
and again, it's a consequence of the system that we have, that important things like this don't even get discussed. They don't get debated. They don't get talked about, brought up. And
Look at our tax bills.
yes,
There we go.
Right.
That's why
And-
where we're at today as people.
Yeah.
They can't figure it out.
right. And again, it's a consequence of how the system is constructed. And I think ranked choice voting offers a really significant means of grabbing that lever and moving the world. So that's why I'm here today, and that's why I've been a supporter for years. Yeah.
Administrator?
Yeah, so thinking about, I'm sorry, thinking about Commissioner Hawkins' example, where you have a field of 10 candidates. And let's say that the candidate with only the fourth most first choice votes ultimately wins the election. How do you communicate that? Like how for jurisdictions that already have this system, what level of information do they provide about how you arrive at a certain result? Because that process can be really, if you're not familiar with it, can be really unexpected and can lead to
Yes.
some results that you might not.
Yeah, you might not have
anticipate.
anticipated. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and well, first of all, as people become acclimated to using ranked choice voting, they understand that that is a possibility. I will say a remote possibility.
Mhm.
I participated in St. Paul elections like 3 or 4 years ago, and there were like 12 candidates on the ballot for mayor.
Mhm.
People were asked to rank them. Turned out that Melvin Carter won without even going to the second ballot. He had like 54% of the first choice. So those cases that you're describing, they can happen,
Mhm.
but they're relatively rare. And when they do happen, I think it's a matter of explaining, well, here's how it happened. And people, you can map it out. You say, well, here's how the first choice vote went. This candidate was eliminated, the votes transferred up. Here's the second round. Here's how that went. There's a really interesting podcast. It was Story Lab.
I heard that.
Yes.
In Ireland, was
Yes,
it? Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah. it was
Fascinating.
really
And it was
well
a
done.
case like you're describing. This woman, she thought she was out of it.
Mhm.
But it turns out that there just was not really strong support for the front runners.
Mhm.
But she had really good support from a broad sector of the population. And even though they weren't picking her necessarily as their first choice, they liked her as an option if their other first choices weren't going to win. It was fascinating. It's not Story Lab, Radio Lab.
I couldn't
Really-
remember who did it.
Yeah.
I knew it was on like
Super interesting. But it was a lot about ranked choice voting and how it works.
That would be a really good thing for you all to listen to. I'll try to find a
Yeah,
a
or
link to that.
I can look for it and
because
send
it's
you an
really-
email.
It really kind of illustrates in a real life example how this works.
Yeah, it really excites me because I feel like we all get briefed on the state of politics, you know, that we're seeing across the country, and I feel like when there's more options, or realistic options, or it's not a black and white or right or wrong, good or evil situation, that there's more room for people to talk with each other, and it really gives people, it makes their vote count more, frankly. Your
Right.
vote isn't just, you're not throwing away, like I think about, well, say Bush Gore and Nader, that election, and Nader got like what, 3% of the vote or
I can't
something?
remember the number, it was 5 maybe, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Anyway.
And the argument was, well, that took away from Gore or whatever and that sort of thing. It's just interesting thinking about the last round of Republican primaries and the last round of, and this is the national Democratic, how many people were in there and just how things would have shook out maybe differently if it was just all one on the ballot and having all those options and ranking. It's just really interesting. And I just see a lot of hope there.
I think, to your point, it does take away from some of the strategies that have been used where you put somebody up as the spoiler.
Exactly.
Those tactics have been used in the past.
Yes.
Everybody can see that it's happening, but it's still happening.
Right.
And so then you are left, in some cases, feeling like the system had been manipulated to get
Right.
a result. And if they do that today, then, as you say, with that person knowing they're not going to get a majority of the votes, when they're the lower one, they drop out, and then
Right.
those votes get reapplied. So you have that piece of it, and it does take some of that out. And I think the thing to me that was most interesting is that the psychological aspect of taking away that piece of negative campaign.
Mm-hmm.
I think that has a lot of strength because too much focus gets put on these things, and people spend way too much time trying to validate whether these things that are being said even have merit or are true.
Right.
Instead of what are their stances on these, issues of social importance, what you're trying to do.
Yeah, this,
And that's where, to me, it has strength, and clearly it's been proven.
yeah, this tactic of putting up spoiler candidates, I mean, that goes away entirely. And to Commissioner Mills' point, if in an election with a strong third-party candidate, anybody can vote for that person, like, with a good conscience. So, like, I'm expressing my will for this person. I like what this person stands for. Even though I know that person's probably not going to win, but it doesn't matter. I'm not wasting my vote by voting for that person. I'm going to express my support, but I'm pretty aware that that can win. Here's my second choice. And here's my third choice. So there's no wasted votes, no spoiler.
Well, my hope would be that would engage more voters. To give, I mean, because Cook County has awesome voter turnout, but that's not so for a lot of the state and the country. And it leads to poor representation, in my opinion.
And it does tend to increase voter turnout. At least that's the, it's hard to say exactly cause and effect, but in places where ranked choice voting has been implemented, voter turnout tends to go up, which is great. We want that.
Well, it's been a very informative discussion, and I think we all have lots of questions and certainly are interested in talking to constituents about this. I certainly look at it from improving the civility of elections and campaigning. I think that would be a real plus.
Yeah.
So I just appreciate so much that you came to us today and could share this information, and I would encourage people to reach out to you with questions
Please do.
as we think of them.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your giving me a chance to talk to you about it. So, and with respect to the resolution support, I mean, it would be great if at some point you can talk about it and would be willing to pass this on. So I think it's could be one more little push to see this implemented broadly.
Commissioner Mills.
In terms of the 2032 prediction.
Well, okay,
Yeah,
so I'm not actually, just to be clear, I am not paid by Fair Vote Minnesota. I'm just making this number up out, but I'm just saying it's a ways away, basically.
Yeah.
Well, and then to Commissioner Hawkins' point about just the party structure of, having that political structure in place, there's significant turnover happening in the Senate now. A lot of retirements. And Senator Bach was actually writing a bill against the local option, or co-sponsored or something. And so with all these new members, I'm wondering if there might be better appetite for it, or if there's kind of more of the same to it.
Well, fingers crossed.
I really appreciate this template too,
Yeah,
information.
it's very
It'll
helpful.
help to go through
Good.
and run this by constituents too, to see if there's concerns, but it makes a lot of sense to me, and I really appreciate your time.
Good, well, thanks. Appreciate
All right,
appreciate
thank you
being
so
here.
much.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I will,
Appreciate
I could leave all the candy here, but my wife will want the basket back. We all.
We're good. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles.
All right. Well, remaining on our agenda are just a few informational items, minutes from personnel, public safety and transportation, and our building committee. And with that, we are adjourned. Have a good rest of the day.